I can't tell you how good it feels to be working on Stiles series Synopsis again. For those of you that don't know, I had about a 5-month hiatus while I was working on a different yet slightly related project. I've got a lot of catching up to do, so let's get started. This is normally when I begin to talk about the game's development cycle, but I could find very little worth talking about when it comes to the development of this game. Truth be told, the most interesting thing about Final Fantasy III is how long it took for most of the world to get their hands on it. So why is it that Square refused to give us the game for so long? A lot of people like to cite the game's difficulty as the main reason, as it was a frequent practice for the Japanese industry to alter or outright refuse to release games that they thought would be too difficult for the rest of the world to play. A rather famous example of this is Super Mario Bros. 2, which was replaced with a reskinned version of a game called Doki Doki Panic, with the real Super Mario Bros. 2 not being released worldwide until it was bundled with the other Mario games as the Lost Levels in Super Mario All-Stars. The truth of the matter is far less scandalous. It just so happens that Final Fantasy III has a repeated history of really bad timing. 1990 was a huge year for Square, with both the North American release of the first Final Fantasy game and the Japanese release of Final Fantasy III. The series was proving to be highly successful, and talks were being had about localizing Final Fantasies II and III as well, but there were other factors to consider. Final Fantasy III launched only 6 months before the release of the Super Nintendo, and with the prospect of new upcoming hardware, it was seeming less and less viable to put time and money into localizing games that would inevitably be seen as outdated. And while Final Fantasy was doing reasonably well overseas with praise from critics, RPGs were still a niche genre outside of Japan. It also didn't help that even if they wanted to push for the localization anyway, technical limitations would have prevented it. Final Fantasy III was the largest NES game ever released, and there simply was not enough memory on the cartridges at the time to hold an English translation, since the language uses so many more characters than the original text, and Final Fantasy III was a relatively text-heavy game for the time. Ultimately, Square decided that the best course of action was to focus their efforts on creating Final Fantasy IV on the Super Nintendo instead, leaving 2 and 3 as Japan exclusives. This, of course, was the first step to the naming fiasco that every fan of the series is now privy to, with Final Fantasy IV being labeled as Final Fantasy II and Final Fantasy VI being labeled as Final Fantasy III. Of course, once we discovered this discrepancy, fans rightfully wanted to get access to the older games. And in time we would. Eventually, Square began to re-release older Final Fantasy titles for the PlayStation in the form of ports and remakes, which did give players official access to both Final Fantasy II and Final Fantasy V for the first time. But Final Fantasy III remained unlocalized, instead being replaced by the Super Nintendo classic Chrono Trigger. This has led a lot of people to question why this was the case, and I have my own speculative reasons for this. These collections contained emulated versions of the Super Nintendo games, which means very little work had to be put into them outside of the new translation jobs. In contrast to this, Square decided to completely remake Final Fantasies I and II, presumably because they felt that the presentation of the NES titles would not sell well on the PlayStation, where the competition for RPGs was much steeper than it had previously been. As we discussed in my Final Fantasy I video, the Origins Edition is indeed a great remake, but it didn't come out until 2002. More than 2 years after the launch of the PlayStation 2. This led to a rather familiar problem, with a 2D remake of Final Fantasy III for outdated hardware seeming like a non-viable option. There was also a notable attempt to release a 2D remake of the game for the Japan-exclusive handheld system, the WonderSwan Color, which was a little-known competitor to the Game Boy Advance. The game never got very far into development, however, as the WonderSwan sales fizzled out and the production for the system ceased, dashing the hope of series fans once again as Final Fantasy III was hit with another bout of wrong place, wrong time. This blow was quite devastating, as Final Fantasies I, II, and IV all were released for the system and eventually were ported to the original PlayStation and Game Boy Advance. This meant that with the exception of a fan translation released in 1999, players outside of Japan had no way to experience Final Fantasy III. It wasn't until 2006, 16 years after the game's initial release, that the rest of the world would finally get their hands on an official version of the game in the form of a 3D remake for the DS. It's rumored that the game was actually going to be a remake for the PlayStation 2 until Nintendo specifically asked Square to create the game for their new handheld instead. I note this interesting bit of trivia because it ties into the previous timeline of failed release attempts quite nicely, and the decision to release the game on the DS had a profound impact on the final product, which we will get into soon enough. Anyway, in the decades since, we've received multiple multiple ports of this 3D version, with very few differences between them, the implementation of the magnet system in the original DS version being the biggest exception, which has been omitted in every version since, and thus is something I won't really be covering in this video since I'm playing the Steam release. Now that the game has been made so readily available, it is much easier to peel back the layers and really dissect the game on its own merits, without the allure and excitement of finally having access to the series' missing link, which does not bode well for this title. The original Famicom version of Final Fantasy III, while technically superior to its predecessors, lacks both the legacy of the first title and the fascinating atrociousness of the second title. It also doesn't help that by the time this game came to the West, we'd already seen the main gimmick more refined in both Final Fantasy V and Final Fantasy Tactics. This unfortunate series of events makes Final Fantasy III the least memorable and most skippable game in the entire main series due to no real fault of its own. But that's enough history. Let's talk about the game's presentation. The first word that comes to my mind when someone brings up Final Fantasy III is the word cute. It relies on a chibi and colorful art style that was likely crafted more by necessity than by artistic vision, though I don't mean for that to come off as a negative. Since the game was originally released on the DS, there was only so much they were capable of rendering in 3D. But much like when the original PlayStation launched, there was a huge push to create 3D games for the system to show off its capabilities as a handheld. In that sense, it's very much a product of its time, and it's only an issue in hindsight since Square has done very little to enhance the presentation of its multiple ports. Now, I must admit that I do have a very strong preference for the 2D style presented in the past two remakes I've covered, but it's important to remember that those remakes came out after Final Fantasy III's and were meant to be anniversary editions that preserved the original styles, while Final Fantasy III was meant to push a modern console by selling a modernized version of a game that many in the world had never gotten the chance to play. With all that in mind, I feel that the charming style presented here fits well for Final Fantasy III specifically, given that it is a lighthearted romp that never takes itself very seriously. Most of my positivity regarding the visual design wasn't referenced specifically to the character models, however. In terms of area design, this 3D reinterpretation acts as a bit of a double-edged sword. The use of 3D presents a sense of scale that the prior two games weren't able to properly present, but the DS's lack of power made all these areas look simple and at times lazy, even when compared to the previous games that relied almost solely on tile sets. The game's camera is also incredibly zoomed in compared to previous games. This was done because they could only render so much 3D on screen without making the game lag, but it leaves the game feeling rather claustrophobic at times. Functionality was prioritized above all else, and I can't fault the devs for that, but the visuals leave me feeling apathetic above all else. As usual, the music is outstanding. It is catchy but simple and fits the colorful aesthetics perfectly, bringing to life a game that would have otherwise been lacking if left to rely on the visuals alone. In terms of my personal preference, this is my least favorite soundtrack of the first trilogy, but in a string of fantastic soundtracks, it is by no means a weak one. For me, the songs just don't quite contain the same adventurous punch of the first game or the sweeping emotional score of the second. I'm sorry that this section is so brief, I just have very little to say about the presentation of this title. It's simple, leaning towards the bland side of things, but everything is distinguishable, which is good at least. And I did find the character models adorable and the enemy designs comedic. In a good way. And even if they aren't my preferred style, they do work in context. This is mostly a case of what you see is what you get. There's very little to delve into here, which is something that the presentation and story have in common. This section is more of a formality than anything. Final Fantasy III has very little in the way of story. In fact, despite having more dialogue, I'd argue that nothing is accomplished here that wasn't better accomplished in the original Final Fantasy. The game relies on a series of half measures in an attempt to flesh out the story, and none of it really leaves a lasting impact. Final Fantasy III has you following the four Warriors of Light as they attempt to restore the power to the crystals and save the world. That's the basic premise anyway. The game attempts to go a bit deeper than that by adding some yin and yang undertones with the introduction of the Dark Warriors towards the end of the game, but there's very little to dissect here. I'm going to speak about the plot using broad strokes from this point forward in the interest of saving time and getting to the more interesting bits of this analysis. So let's get to it. There's a lack of cohesion permeating Final Fantasy III's story that makes the whole thing feel weak, and a lot of these issues are less tangible than in other games I've reviewed. While playing, I couldn't shake the feeling that the game's plot was made up as the writers went along. Like, the dungeons and towns were designed, and then the writers phoned in the why and how regarding the characters afterwards. Now, a lot of great games have been designed this way, but it really sticks out in Final Fantasy III because so many of the game's events are completely removed from the core story, and they kind of feel superficial. This problem extends to the characters, which I know for certain were written in as an afterthought because originally Final Fantasy III's main cast was comprised of blank slates, just as they were in the first Final Fantasy game. The designers of the remake tried to work new personalities and backstories into this version for the characters, and I can admit it was an admirable attempt, but it does very little to cover up their origins as player avatars and nothing more. This game is also the first in the series to create a rather infamous trend of the last boss coming completely out of nowhere, which is something that will be brought up later in this series as it's more egregious in those more story-centric games. While here, it fits with the absurdness of it all, for better or for worse. I really don't mean to harp on this game's storytelling as it didn't hamper my enjoyment in the slightest, but after Final Fantasy II attempted to tell a more complex narrative than the genre was used to seeing at the time, I can't help but feel like the simplicity of Final Fantasy III's plot feels like a large step backward, which is surprising given how much Final Fantasy II's story was praised after its release. It wasn't as if Final Fantasy II was a flop and Square felt the need to go back to basics, so it's truly puzzling to me. In a way, it kind of feels wrong to dissect Final Fantasy III's story. It's not good, but it also doesn't feel like it was meant to be. It feels like it was meant to cater to a much younger audience than the first two games, which is kind of ironic given that it's one of, if not the most difficult game in the main series. Either way, it's very clear that Final Fantasy III's goal was never to tell a story in the first place, so it feels a bit antithetical to judge the game so harshly on those merits. The designer intent was clearly to focus on the gameplay, and that's what I really need to analyze. Despite the graphical overhaul, Final Fantasy III attempts to stay as close to the original version as possible in terms of gameplay. For example, while the dungeons are now rendered in 3D, they still have nearly identical layouts to the 2D release, which is great for the sake of preservation, but bad for the game in terms of functionality. Level design is something not often touched on when discussing RPGs, and it's easy to see why. Most of the time, reviews are focused on the presentation, story, and combat. Final Fantasy III forces me to discuss this often overlooked topic, however, as its dungeon design fluctuates often from being painfully sterile and boring to being ridiculously convoluted and long-winded. There are a few dungeons in the game that are quite literally straight lines where you walk from one side of the screen to the other, offering no creativity whatsoever. On the other side of the spectrum, we have dungeons like Final Fantasy III's final dungeon, the Crystal Tower, which can be incredibly complicated to traverse, filled with multiple paths, invisible walls, and frequent random encounters. I don't think it's much of an exaggeration to say that 2/3 of Final Fantasy III's dungeons are either boring or frustrating, with the final third being relatively fun. There is one aspect of the game's design that I will praise, however, and that is the use of gimmicks. More specifically, the few moments of the game where you are forced to cast mini on your party to get to smaller areas is one I enjoyed. I always love it when a game puts temporary restrictions on the player's skill sets, forcing them to rethink their usual strategies and improvise. I would have loved to have seen more of this in the game, though it did unfortunately lead to some more of the boring linear dungeons that I mentioned above. Even so, I wanted to praise this game on a moment of creativity that I felt actually succeeded instead of petering out. Now, in terms of overworld exploration, I'd say that the game handles things about as well as the original does, with a bigger map and more freedom to explore things out of order. I did have that familiar moment of not knowing where I was supposed to go next at a couple points, but I was never stuck as long as I had been in my initial playthrough of the first Final Fantasy, which is good. Upon Final Fantasy III's initial release, it was the first game to have multiple side quests, which was a great addition. Sure, Final Fantasy had the class upgrade from Bahamut, which was awesome, but that was just one optional moment, while Final Fantasy III has secret dungeons, bosses, even a couple of hidden towns. This is an aspect I particularly enjoy, and acts as a huge step up from the first two titles. Unfortunately, it's something I almost forgot to talk about because it was so overshadowed by the game's other design choices, one of the most notable being the difficulty. As I've already stated, Final Fantasy III may be the most difficult game in the main series, which is something that I found refreshing, to a point. This game follows in the footsteps of the original version of Final Fantasy by limiting your saves to only one location, in this case being the world map instead of inns, while severely limiting your access to healing items such as Phoenix Downs, which cannot be bought in stores. The game also continues to make use of spell charges as the first game did, and making item and spell conservation hugely important to the player's survival. With all that this game borrows from the first Final Fantasy, I wish it had also borrowed that game's pacing and difficulty curve. Final Fantasy I was far from perfect in that regard, with the Ice Cavern being a particularly nasty difficulty spike that I commented on in that video. But Final Fantasy III has several comparable spikes throughout its campaign, with the most egregious, once again, being the final dungeon. This dungeon in particular has become quite infamous to series fans, as it's actually comprised of 3 dungeons, with only one place to save throughout and about a dozen of the game's most difficult bosses within. This trek can easily take a player up to 3 hours, and one misstep means all of that time and work will be lost. This means that many players will have to grind a whole 10 levels from the 40s to the 50s to even have a chance of success, with some wanting to grind even higher to ensure it. Now, there's something to be said for making the final dungeon difficult. After all, it should be. It should be the final challenge. You should feel great when you overcome it. But this level discrepancy points more to a lack of pacing and care than it does to actually being a design decision. It's interesting to note that the main reason for Final Fantasy III's remake being so difficult is that the limitations on the DS made it so that devs at Matrix Software could only render 3 monsters on screen at a time, while the original game allowed for up to 8. To compensate for this shortcoming, all the enemies the player is faced with have been buffed to roughly match the strength of 2 enemies. This means that being hit once is like being hit by 2 enemies. Being hit by 2 enemies is equal to being hit by 4, etc. So if the enemy focuses fire on one party member, you have a higher chance of having a character killed in a single round, statistically speaking, than you would with the old system. If the key element of the first Final Fantasy was exploration, and the key element of Final Fantasy II was the story, then the key element of Final Fantasy III would be its combat, or more specifically, the job system that lays the foundation for the combat. The inclusion of this game's main gimmick truly and fundamentally alters every aspect of its design in ways that I don't think many players realize, and in ways that Square was not, at the time, capable of properly handling. First of all, any game that is focused around a job or class system is inherently going to have trouble being well balanced in terms of difficulty. And those of you who watch my content regularly have likely noticed I consider good gameplay balancing and pacing essential to making a great game. So you'd think that this would be an automatic red flag from my stance, but it's not quite that simple. The more variables you add to a game, the more arduous of a task it becomes to balance it. So expecting a game of this magnitude to be perfectly balanced would be a tall order for any developer. Now, this does not, of course, excuse the game's lack of polish in that regard. It's just something to think about. In the modern day, you can see this sort of discussion coming about a lot when it comes to the bugginess of games. The question of, why does Bethesda get a free pass when no other company does, is a frequent example. It is a good question. Why does Bethesda get a free pass? Well, frankly, they shouldn't, and in a lot of cases they don't. But when you look at the number of variables present in a game like Skyrim versus the number of variables present in something like Homefront Revolution, it paints a clearer picture and sets different standards. Anyway, back to Final Fantasy III. It's also important to note that perfect balancing in games that contain systems like this would completely defeat the purpose of choice and experimentation in the first place. If different combinations couldn't possibly lead to some more interesting and more beneficial results, there would be absolutely no point in having a customizable job system in the game at all, because all of the classes would function in nearly an identical fashion, just with different clothes on. In games with a class system like Final Fantasy III's, it's arguably the developer's intention for the players to experiment until they make a team that is as overpowered as possible, which brings us back to a statement I made in my original Final Fantasy video when I was comparing the Origins edition to the PSP edition. If you are a power gamer, you will likely love exploiting all the most powerful classes and gear to trounce your enemies without breaking a sweat, while gamers that prefer a bit of adversity likely wouldn't enjoy the type of gameplay as much. I unfortunately fall into the latter camp most of the time. Luckily for me, Final Fantasy III is one of the most difficult games in the main series for reasons we've already discussed, which helps to appeal to my personal tastes, but it doesn't flow well with the overall game design. You see, the high difficulty actually hurts the class system because the game all but demands you use the best classes or else spend hours grinding to try and use a more creative party build. This scenario is arguably worse than having your characters be overpowered because it strips away the freedom that the game's job system taunts you with by effectively making the subpar options not viable at all. Let's break it down in more detail. Final Fantasy III has 23 classes, which seems like quite a bit of variety, but unfortunately that number is misleading. 5 of the principal classes in the game have direct upgrades, which means that when the new ones are unlocked, there is absolutely no reason to use weaker versions anymore. These jobs are Black Mage to Magus, White Mage to Devout, Monk to Black Belt, Evoker to Summoner, and Warrior to Knight. That takes away 5 jobs from the total pool immediately. In addition to that, if I'm being generous, there are a minimum of 4 jobs that will be completely useless to the average player. Those being the Freelancer, which is the starting job that should be ignored as soon as you get your first choice in real jobs. Next is the Scholar, which uses books for weapons and can cast only level 1 spells. This class in particular is irritating because the game all but forces you to use it just to defeat a single boss, which is a frequently cited misstep of this game. The next useless class is the Geomancer, which admittedly does have some powerful attacks, but they all come from your terrain, meaning their effectiveness is completely decided by the game itself and not any player input. And lastly, we have the Onion Knight. Technically speaking, the Onion Knight is the best class in the entire game, but only if you level your characters up into their 90s, which is completely pointless given that the game can be beaten while your character's around level 55. That makes 9 classes out of the 23 not viable options for one reason or another. To put that another way, 39% of your choices are non-viable in a standard playthrough. That's not even taking into account the arguable effectiveness of the remaining jobs that I didn't mention, which have their own wide spectrum of usefulness. Each class in the game is given only one special command to make them unique. If you want to cast magic, you obviously have to be a mage, and at least that gives you some gameplay variety. But if you want to play a physical character, you are left with only 2 real choices, despite what it would appear. You can either take a job that grants an attack that does extra damage for some sort of cost, as is the case for the Dragoon, Dark Knight, and Ninja, or you are given the ability to tank more efficiently, as is the case for the Knight and Viking. But even if I ignore the balancing issues and lack of variety in the classes, the game still doesn't encourage experimentation, at least not properly. Whether intentionally or not, the game tends to only give out weapons and equipment for certain classes at specific points in the game. If this was done intentionally, it was obviously to encourage use of some of the newly acquired classes that the player has received. While I can understand the motive here, it is both unnecessary and detrimental to the experience. It is unnecessary because players are going to be naturally curious about the new cool things that they've unlocked, and upon viewing the new classes, if one looks interesting to them, they will choose to use it of their own volition. It's detrimental because the game often neglects to give the player equipment for more standard or previously unlocked classes for long stretches of time, instead only giving out items for the newer classes. This ends up punishing players for wanting to stick with classes that they already enjoy, or in some cases, because of this game's poor balancing, punishes players for wanting to stick with classes that are actually useful. Many of the people who have played this game likely haven't even noticed these issues. I know that I didn't on my first playthrough, and I can admit that all of these precise statements may seem minuscule in the grand scheme, but I decided to focus on them because they're the only interesting thing to discuss about Final Fantasy III. It's an overall pretty mediocre experience, but most people have been unable to pinpoint why, and these are what I feel to be the main underlying issues as to why the game is so middling. So many people look at a game and say, I don't like it because the gameplay is bad, but my goal has always been to ask why. Why is the gameplay bad? Then I ask why again. I continue to ask until I find what I think is the true root of each issue, because oftentimes it is a multitude of minuscule artifacts that make the big picture fuzzy. Oh, right. I always talk about the bonus content in these things. Does 30 hours of grinding to take down one boss sound fun? Yeah, not to me either. It's unfortunate, but upon glancing over my notes, I'm hard-pressed to think of anything that Final Fantasy III does particularly well. Despite all of my criticisms, I really do enjoy playing Final Fantasy III every time I pick it up. I especially enjoyed this last playthrough where I got to sit back and play it with a controller on my TV instead of on a tiny handheld. But while I always enjoyed this game, nothing from it ever really sticks with me. Honestly, it just feels like the most forgettable title in the main series to me. And doesn't that just make perfect sense given its late release in the West? I find it rather apropos. I want to stress that Final Fantasy III is not an awful game, nor is it an unimportant one. Its job system laid the groundwork for a gameplay style that the series revisits fairly often, both in the mainline entries and the series spin-offs. Not to mention that when it first came out as an NES title, it was leagues beyond the first two in terms of user-friendliness and gameplay creativity. But I am playing and reviewing this game now, not when it was originally released. I feel that with the exception of its historical significance, the title has very little else to offer beyond being a by-the-numbers, mediocre old-school RPG with a refreshingly challenging difficulty and a job system that was, at least at the time, a novel one that severely lacked polish. If you enjoy Final Fantasy V or Bravely Default, it may be worth checking out the game that created the style in the first place, but I find it hard to recommend to a more general audience. Alright, we finished the NES trilogy, but before we move on to Final Fantasy IV, I have another trilogy I need to cover. Those of you who remember my announcement video for this series will remember that I said I wanted to cover every Final Fantasy game, not just the main series, which means it's about time I take a look at some spin-offs. Next time I'll be taking a look at Final Fantasy Legends, all 3 of them in one video. So don't worry, we'll be getting back to the main series soon enough. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching. Please don't forget to like, comment, especially comment, I love reading those, share and subscribe. Also, if you want some more gaming stuff, of course, I have more videos. I just got done with that 5-month project I told you about, which is a 2-hour dissection of Final Fantasy 15. If you're a fan, you may not want to watch it. It's pretty brutal. And on top of that, if you want more gaming news, reviews, stuff like that, you can check out Super Game Reviews. It's a site I'm partnered with. They're pretty great. Anyway, thanks again. See you all later.